living in a country that's the finest place on earth. But some folks don't appreciate this land that gave them birth. I hear that up in Washington they're having an awful fuss, 'cause communists and spies were making monkeys out of us.
Anti-communism is a reappearing theme in United States history throughout the 20th century. From the very first rescue to the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States has gone through different stages along with different political changes. For the past several decades, these changes impact American lives greatly from various aspects such as education, career, ideology, technology, and so on. In 1945 and 1946, disagreements between the Western powers and the Soviet Union arose over many issues. Neither side could overcome the mistrust that had already existed for almost 30 years. The passage of the Truman Doctrine in 1947, the development of the Marshall Plan in 1948, and the creation of the NATO in 1949 formed the foundation for U.S. efforts in waging the Cold War. From the late 1950s to early 1970s, the space race became an important part of the Cold War and had an impact on American lives. The Soviet Union, which excelled in large missile development, stunned Americans in October 1957 when it became the first nation to place a satellite. In April 1961, the Soviet Union became the first country to send a human in space. These achievements created tension and pushed the U.S. in the direction of lunar program in the following years, which bring huge impact to Americans.
I remember it as it created a great deal of concern in the United States because we thought that we were premier in our ability to, particularly, their invention and science. But then when it did happen, it created a great deal of heartburn. I do remember that there was a book at the time that said, "Why Ivan Can Read and Johnny Can't."
In 1962, President Kennedy delivered a speech, "We choose to go to the moon," which signals the beginning of the lunar program.
Its conquest deserves the best of all mankind. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win.
The space program directly led to changes in American school system.
The curriculum for the school changed.
Yes.
So if you were college prep, at that point in public schools you had vocational, which was the trade, construction, that kind of thing, woodworking stuff, secretarial, and college. And if you were in the college track, then you had to take more math and science.
Yes, you were expected.
All of a sudden. It was like STEM is today. Everybody's, we need engineers, we need mathematicians.
But they would set up actually what you call honors, but we called them advanced classes, and the expectation was that you would get up to calculus in the schools.
And that's when AP started.
And really, calculus before that was...
We were the first generation for APs.
But before that, calculus was considered something that only engineers did.
Yeah.
And so it was not something that an American high school student would be, you weren't expected to do that kind of thing. So it did rather dramatically change. And also that's when, as Carol said, the APs, so the expectation was by the time you were a senior, you would take some AP science.
The success of the lunar program also sparks many social changes.
And so the American astronauts became really the great heroes. I remember. I mean, they were trotted out on television. They were lionized. They were made, and so they were the true, American heroes. And so there was a lot of,
hoopla.
Yeah, you could call it that. And so when, say, John Glenn went up and circled the globe and orbited, when he came back, he was an incredible hero. I don't know if you know, but he later became a United States Senator for many, many years. And so there are Tom Wolfe has written some books about,
A book called The Right Stuff.
yeah, which is about those first astronauts and the kinds of things that went into it.
The space race also influenced American popular culture.
You get there was a famous, when I was in junior high, there was a famous instrumental piece of music that made #1 on the Pop-Tarts called Telstar.
Yeah.
And do do do.
Yeah.
The music, television, Star Trek
Yes.
came out of all that. So that was part of it. It hit television. There were also a lot of, that's where all the space movies and television shows, Battlestar Galactica, and there were a whole series of them.
Even though accomplishments from the space race were largely political, the developments in science and industries impacted not only generations of people, but also the pop culture, which some still remain influential today. The Vietnam War was a continuation of the Indochina War of 1946 to 1954. American involvement began in 1950 when President Truman invoked the Mutual Defense Assistance Act of 1949 to provide aid to French forces in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Early U.S. aims were to halt the spread of communism and to encourage French participation in the international defense of Europe. President Kennedy viewed the conflict in South Vietnam as a test case of communist expansion by means of local wars of national liberation. For that reason, as well as a continuing commitment to the general policy of containment, Kennedy enlarged the U.S. effort in South Vietnam. In the United States, military conscription has been used many times during its wars, particularly in the Cold War. During the Vietnam War, about 2/3 of American troops were volunteered. The rest was selected for military services through the draft. The draft lottery was based on birth dates. There were 366 blue plastic capsules containing birth dates placed into a deep glass container. The capsules were drawn by hand, opened one by one, and then assigned to a sequence number started from 001 until 366. The first date drawn was September 14th, followed by April 24th. Which was assigned to 001 and 002 respectively. The drawing process continued until each day of the year was assigned to a lottery number. The lower the number was, the higher probability men with the corresponding birthday would be called to serve. The secondary lottery was held on the same day with 26 letters of the alphabet to determine the order of selection among men with the same birthday through the ranks of the first letters of the last, first, and middle names. The draft lotteries were conducted again in 1970, 1971, and 1972. The draft brought a lot of impact on American families. The design of this draft is also in response to criticism of draft inequalities.
Well, start today. Today, we have an all-volunteer army.
Yeah, there is no such
There
thing
is
as a
no
draft.
draft.
Right.
And that's because of Vietnam.
But after the draft started again, there had been a draft in World War I, and then it had been lapsed, and then there was a draft again in World War II. But after World War II, because of the Cold War, they continued to draft. Back to the story, what happened is they put in this draft, or this lottery system where everybody's name was put in and there was to be no deferments, but they wouldn't take nearly as many. The idea was that they would only need a small percentage of the people that were available at any given time.
Another piece of this was that it was also around the time of the Civil Rights Movement. And so you're talking a lot about equality and equal rights, and there was a predominant number of poor blacks who were drafted.
Which is somewhat ironic. So I was in the first lottery, and I got a very high...
So the lottery was so that everybody was in the same pool, and it was chance whether you went or not.
Supposedly. I'm not convinced. But anyway, so I was lucky. I got a very high number, so I did not have to.
So it was just luck, whatever your number was. As I said, my brother's one day different. He was number 10. Dennis was 320.
Yeah.
The Vietnam War was the first American televised war. The footage of the war impacts Americans greatly. It gradually changed people's attitude towards a lot of political and social issues at that time, including anti-communism.
And what happened is it was a television in the sense that the American leadership had said, we're winning. There's a light at the end of the tunnel, we're winning. And then the Vietnamese launched what was called the Tet Offensive, which was a holiday over there. And they took over some of the cities. And what was the one that they took? Da Nang, I think. And they also in Saigon. And so that was when the American public really started to question both our leadership and why are we fighting this war. Oh yeah, it was.
Yeah. I remember the immolation of that Buddhist monk.
Yeah.
It was on Life magazine. I'll never forget that image. It was on the
to protest, these monks set themselves on fire.
Buddhist monks.
And that was horrific. And I do remember that there's that famous picture of a young girl, 9, 10.
Yes, napalm.
Napalm had burned her clothes off. She's running down the road. But it did have an incredible effect because of television.
Yeah.
Because you had these images of, we saw the American embassy, for instance, being defended by our soldiers against an assault. And this is in the heart of what was supposed to be secure area. And so that's when Americans started to question how well it was going, and B, whether it was worth it.
The Vietnam War also sparked a lot of anti-war movement and social unrest during the 60s and 70s. Over the years of Vietnam War, a broad-based and vocal anti-war movement arose in the United States, representing virtually every segment of American society. The influence of the anti-war movement was so significant that by 1968 it played a central role in the U.S. government's evolving Vietnam policy. Some also claimed that the movement was the major factor ending American involvement in Vietnam.
And we kind of knew Vietnam. My brother had a girlfriend whose brother had gone to France, and he was over there. And the French, this is before America geared up into it, and the French were protesting against the Vietnam War. And there were riots in Paris, and my brother's girlfriend's brother got caught in a protest riot, and he was, saying, "Je suis Américain," and they smashed him, and he lost an eye. He was blind in an eye because he was beaten up in the protest by the police.
Yeah.
And so, this tension between government and protest, and you mentioned last time about Kent State. So that was my sophomore year in college, and that night, the night of Kent State, our college was about an hour away from Kent State. And when that happened, students just left Kent State and went to all the neighboring campuses. And there was a huge protest and vigil, I still remember the candlelight vigil right outside my dorm window that night. So students were just shocked that the National Guard would shoot unarmed students. This is when police started to be called cops, pigs, police brutality, all this stuff, and there was a huge disrespect for authority, government authority, huge. And then another piece of that was when, with the Tonkin Gulf resolution and what was going on with LBJ, and it turns out that that was all fabricated, then it was a lie. And then the body counts, they were inflated, deflated for the Americans, inflated for the Vietnamese, and our generation coming out of college just said, you can't trust the government.
The Vietnam conflict changed the attitudes of a generation. More and more American citizens became suspicious, skeptical, and cynical about the government and public institutions in the wake of the Vietnam War. The military, in particular, was discredited for years after the conflict.
Well, and our son, our oldest son, decided that he wanted to be a Navy pilot when he was 10 years old. And we kept saying, yeah. And we were so against it because we just had this bad attitude about military and the war, and you know, it was very different than our parents who saw them as heroes.
Right.
You know, we didn't.
I mean, people would spit on soldiers when they came back from Vietnam.
And I remember the first time that you know, and the military marches, you know, these World War II vets and Korean vets, and the first time the Vietnam veterans marched, it was very
Emotional.
It was really emotional.
People stood up.
People stood up. People were crying. You know, I mean, the audience. I mean, I remember us doing that.
And that was a stark,
and that's the way it was.
That was a stark contrast to World War II, where those guys came back to ticker tape parades. Heroes, you know, the greatest generation, that's what they're called today. You know, so, you know, you can see it was
saved
almost black
the world
and white.
from Hitler, but thick aspects to it. It was just...
It was traumatic.
There just didn't seem to be anything right about it. And our parents' generation, I don't think, understood.
Vietnam War had far-reaching consequences and impact on most aspects of American life, from the economic, culture, to domestic policies and foreign policy, some of which continue to do so today. On August 13, 1961, the Communist government of the German Democratic Republic began to build a barbed wire and concrete wall between East and West Berlin. The official purpose of this Berlin Wall was to keep Western from entering East Germany and undermining the socialist state, but primarily served the objective of stemming mass defections from East to West. The Berlin Wall remains one of the most powerful and enduring symbols of the Cold War.
Thing about the perception of Americans of Soviet tyranny, and the Berlin Wall and the Iron Curtain for Eastern Europe was all a symbol of the tyranny of communism versus the, you know, wonderfulness and freedom of democracies.
And I do remember that, you know, people used to be, initially people were lionized, oh, look, they're coming across, and they would show these, they would actually have shots of these people coming across, but then eventually it got higher and harder and more difficult, and you would occasionally see newscasts of people trying to get over, and you would hear shots or something like that, and you know, so it got to be very difficult, but it became a symbol. I mean, to the America, it became a symbol of, well, look, it's so bad there that they have to create a barrier to keep their people in. We don't have a barrier. We let our people go to Russia if they want to. You know, if they hate the United States, we don't have a problem with that. So it became a real propaganda coup, and just about every president would go, and you know, and the Berlin Wall became a huge symbol, and it was a symbol of you know, kind of American superiority, American superior morality, that the Russians had to build this wall to keep their people in.
All the way. I'm no communist, I'll tell you that right now.
Anti-communism starting to ease along with the end of the Cold War. However, it had profound impact on American lives, including education, popular culture, ideology, technology, and so on. It influenced a generation of Americans, and some of the impact from anti-communism still remain influential until today.
For it, the more they have to pay. Our public servants should be proud and honest, you would think, instead of taking bribes and dressing up their wives in mink.